When the elderly black woman arrived at the wedding, the bride's family barely acknowledged her, but by the end of the night, they would be begging for her forgiveness. The afternoon sun bathed the grand estate in a golden glow, its sprawling gardens meticulously arranged for the wedding of the year. White roses lined the cobblestone pathways, and crystal chandeliers dangled from towering oak trees, creating an air of effortless luxury. The guests, dressed in designer gowns and custom-tailored suits, sipped on champagne, exchanging stories of extravagant vacations and million-dollar business deals. At the heart of the event stood Olivia Montgomery, the stunning bride, and Michael Carter, her soon-to-be husband. Their love story had been the talk of high society. Olivia, the daughter of an influential business family, and Michael, a highly successful entrepreneur with an inspiring work ethic. But today, amidst the beauty and celebration, something far less romantic was unfolding. Evelyn Carter arrived, with quiet grace, stepping out of the sleek black car with the help of Michael. Her soft silver curls framed a face that, despite the years, still held the same regal presence. Dressed in a modest but elegant navy blue dress, she carried herself with dignity, her warm, brown eyes scanning the crowd with a gentle smile. She had been waiting for this moment, seeing her grandson marry the love of his life. Yet, as she walked through the sea of well-dressed guests, something became painfully clear. The Montgomery family barely acknowledged her. Victoria Montgomery, the bride's mother, stood near the grand entrance, wine glass in hand, watching Evelyn with a barely concealed sneer. She turned to one of her relatives and whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I suppose some people don't know the difference between formal and casual attire." A few polite laughs followed. Evelyn heard it, but she didn't flinch. She had encountered far worse in her lifetime. If you are enjoying this story so far, comment where you are listening to this from and subscribe. Let's see how far our story travels. Olivia's father, Richard Montgomery, merely nodded in Evelyn's direction without offering a handshake or a word of welcome. To him, she was just another guest, an afterthought. The rest of the Montgomery clan followed suit, exchanging judgmental glances, subtly shifting their conversations away whenever Evelyn drew near. Michael noticed, his jaw tightening. But Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's all right, dear," she murmured. "Some lessons take time." As the celebration carried on, the microaggressions only became more evident. When Evelyn took a seat at one of the tables, guests subtly adjusted their chairs away. When she tried to engage in polite conversation, responses were clipped, dismissive. At one point, when she reached for an hors d'oeuvre from a passing tray, Victoria barely concealed her grimace. Michael's hard act for his grandmother, but he also knew her well enough to recognize the quiet confidence she carried. She was unshaken. She had seen these kinds of people before. What the Montgomerys didn't know, what they would soon learn, was that Evelyn Carter was no ordinary woman, and before the night was over, they would be begging for her forgiveness. The reception was in full swing, a dazzling display of wealth and privilege. Guests clinked their champagne glasses, their laughter ringing through the sprawling garden. Waiters in crisp white uniforms well through the crowd, balancing trays of fine wine and gourmet hors. The Montgomery family moved effortlessly through the sea of high society guests, basking in the glow of their own importance. But amid the luxury and celebration, an undercurrent of arrogance tainted the air. Evelyn Carter sat at a round table near the edges of the reception, her presence politely ignored by most of Olivia's family. She noticed the way they fawned over other guests. The esteemed judge, the CEO of a luxury fashion brand, a tech mogul who had flown in from Europe just for the occasion. They showered these individuals with admiration, laughing too loudly at their jokes, hanging on to their every word. But when it came to Evelyn, she was invisible. Victoria Montgomery, perched at a nearby table, swirled the deep red wine in her glass, before leaning in toward a group of relatives. Her lips curled into a practiced smile. Her voice smooth but edged with something sharper. Michael turned out well considering his background. She mused just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. Evelyn lifted her gaze from her teacup, but said nothing. She had lived too many years to be rattled by careless words. Michael, standing a few feet away, stiffened. He turned to Olivia, expecting her to react, to say something, but she hesitated, biting her lip. It was their wedding day, and she didn't want to cause a scene. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on her grandson's arm, a silent reminder, not yet. At another table, Olivia's father, Richard Montgomery, sat comfortably, surrounded by his closest associates. A man of power and influence, he had spent his life making decisions that shaped industries. He spoke in a smooth, authoritative voice, and when he made a joke, people laughed, whether it was funny or not. And now he was entertaining the table with an offhand remark about certain traditions being outdated. His words, though wrapped in a veil of sophistication, carried an unmistakable weight. The subtext was clear. There were old customs, and then there were better customs, the ones people of their status upheld. The Montgomery way. Michael clenched his fists. His family had traditions too. Traditions of resilience, strength, and unity. His grandmother, sitting just a few feet away, was living proof of that. But Richard, he didn't even acknowledge her presence. Evelyn, however, remained unfazed. She had faced far worse in her lifetime. Disrespect from the small-minded was nothing new. Instead of reacting with anger, she responded with grace, offering quiet, thoughtful remarks throughout the evening. When a guest commented on the challenges of managing wealth, Evelyn smiled gently. True wealth isn't measured in numbers, but in the way you treat people. When someone scoffed at the idea of humble beginnings, she merely said, "You'd be surprised how many great things have come from places people choose to overlook." The Montgomerys barely noticed her words, but one man did. Across the reception, a well-dressed, older gentleman sat alone, observing. He had sharp eyes, the kind that missed nothing, and a presence that commanded quiet respect. His tailored suit, though simple, hinted at understated wealth, and the way he carried himself suggested he was no ordinary guest. He watched the way Victoria turned her nose up at Evelyn. He listened to the dismissive tone in Richard's voice. He saw the way guests subtly distanced themselves from the elderly black woman at the table's edge, and he was not impressed. Evelyn, sensing his gaze, met his eyes briefly and offered a knowing smile. Something was about to shift, and soon the Montgomerys would realize that the woman they had disrespected was not someone to be ignored. The reception carried on. The Montgomerys basking in their carefully curated social circle, oblivious to the shift that was about to take place. The gentle hum of classical music underscored the polite chatter, glasses clinking as guests toasted to the newlyweds. Then the event coordinator stepped onto the small stage at the center of the grand reception area, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice ringing through the open-air venue. "It is an honor to introduce a very special guest this evening, an individual whose contributions to business, philanthropy, and social change have left an indelible mark on this country. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest of honor." A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. Olivia's family straightened in their seats. The Montgomerys prided themselves on their elite social circle, and a guest of this caliber could only enhance their prestige. The well-dressed older gentleman, who had been observing the night's events from afar, finally stood. All eyes turned to him. The air buzzed with anticipation as murmurs spread among the guests. But what happened next sent a shock wave through the Montgomery family. Instead of heading to the podium, the distinguished man turned on, his heel directly toward Evelyn Carter. Hush fell over the crowd as he approached the elderly woman with a warm, genuine smile. And then he bowed, his head slightly. "Madam Carter," he said with deep reverence. "It's been too long." Gasps rippled through the audience. "Madam Carter." The tone in his voice, the gesture of respect. This was no casual acquaintance. This was admiration. Evelyn, still seated, met his gaze with a knowing smile. "Ah, William," she said smoothly. "You haven't changed a bit." The Montgomerys froze. William Carter. The name finally registered in their minds. Not just an affluent businessman, a billionaire, a man whose name carried weight in global industries, who had built empires, funded institutions, and changed lives. And here he was, showing deference to the elderly black woman they had dismissed without a second thought. Victoria's wine glass nearly slipped from her grasp. Richard's confident smirk had all but vanished. Olivia, her mouth slightly agape, looked between Evelyn and William, trying to process what was unfolding before her. William gestured for the crowd's attention. "Many of you know me as a businessman, a philanthropist. But I would be nowhere if it weren't for one person, the woman, sitting right here, Evelyn Carter." Stunned silence. He turned to Evelyn and offered a warm nod. "Madam Carter is one of the greatest minds of our time. Decades ago, she built a business empire, from the ground up, shattering every barrier set before her. She has dedicated her life to philanthropy, funding countless scholarships for underprivileged students, ensuring that generations have opportunities that were once denied to people like us." A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests exchanged guilty glances, suddenly recalling their dismissive behavior toward the elderly woman. Others simply gawked, their entire perception of the night shifting in real time. William continued, his voice carrying through the stunned audience. "She didn't just build wealth, she built legacies. She mentored leaders, invested in communities, and opened doors for those who were shut out." The weight of his words settled over the Montgomery family like a crushing realization. The very woman they had treated as less than was a titan in her own right. Far wealthier, far more influential than any of them could ever hope to be. Richard Montgomery swallowed hard. His entire career had been about wealth, power, and knowing the right people. Yet the person he had ignored, no, the person he had disrespected, was someone far beyond his reach. Victoria, still reeling, tried to recover. She forced a brittle smile, leaning toward Evelyn. "Oh, we had no idea," she started, her voice laced with nervous laughter. Evelyn turned to her with a calm, unwavering gaze. "I know," she said simply. And in that moment, Victoria understood the weight of her own arrogance. Michael, who had spent the night biting his tongue, now stood a little taller, his pride for his grandmother shining in his eyes. As for Olivia, she had never felt so utterly ashamed. The night had started with the Montgomerys seeing Evelyn as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their world. But by the end of the night, they realized it was they who were not worthy of being in hers. The grand estate, once filled with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses, now buzzed with hushed whispers. The revelation had sent shock waves through the crowd, and Olivia's family stood frozen in the weight of their own arrogance. Victoria's face had lost its usual composed elegance. Her carefully applied makeup did nothing to hide the sheer humiliation washing over her. She clutched her wine glass, her fingers trembling slightly as she processed the truth. Richard Montgomery, a man who prided himself on always being the most powerful in the room, looked as if he had been punched in the gut. His entire world revolved around knowing the right people, being in the right circles, but the one person he had dismissed without a second thought was the very person whose respect truly mattered. The realization stung deeper than any public embarrassment. guests, now aware of the insult that had transpired, stole discreet glances at Evelyn. Some looked ashamed, others fascinated. A few whispered apologies, under their breath, though they weren't directed at her, more so at themselves, for their silent complicity. Michael, who had spent the evening biting his tongue out of respect for his grandmother, finally stepped forward. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the heavy silence. "It's funny, isn't it?" he said, glancing at Olivia's parents. "You were so concerned with status, so worried about appearances, and yet you just disrespected the most important person in this room." Victoria and Richard flinched. Michael exhaled, shaking his head. "And yet she has done more, built more, given more than most people in this room combined." Olivia, standing beside him, swallowed hard. She could feel the heat rising in her face, not just from second-hand embarrassment, but from the painful realization that her family had revealed their true nature in the worst way possible. Victoria tried to salvage the situation, pasting on a brittle smile. "Evelyn, dear," she began, her tone suddenly saccharine. "I had no idea. You really should have said something earlier. We would have." Evelyn lifted a single hand, stopping her mid-sentence. There was nothing to say. She replied smoothly, her voice calm but unwavering. "A person's worth isn't determined by what they tell you. It's revealed in how you treat them." Victoria's mouth opened then closed. She had no response to that. Richard, ever the businessman, extended a hand toward Evelyn, his smile forced. "Well, Madam Carter, it's truly an honor. Perhaps we can discuss." Evelyn simply looked at his outstretched hand. Then, with effortless grace, she turned away, as if dismissing the entire conversation. It was a greater insult than any words could have delivered. The Montgomerys were used to power, to wealth, to commanding attention in any room they entered. But tonight they learned a lesson they could never undo. Status meant nothing if it was built on arrogance and ignorance. Evelyn, ever composed, didn't gloat. She didn't demand apologies or revel in their humiliation. Instead, she simply smiled and returned to her seat, enjoying her dessert as if nothing had happened, because that was the difference between them. True class wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about power. It was about character, and tonight the Montgomerys had none. The music had resumed, the wedding guests slowly returning to their conversations, though a noticeable shift lingered in the air. The grand estate still glowed under the golden afternoon sun, but the Montgomery family no longer basked in the bike illusion of superiority. Victoria and Richard sat stiffly at their table. Their earlier arrogance now replaced by uncomfortable silence. Their usual effortless charm, the polite smiles they flashed at high society events had been stripped away. They had been exposed not just to the guests but to themselves. For the first time in years, they were forced to reflect. Had they truly built their lives around the shallow idea that wealth determined worth? Victoria's eyes flickered to Evelyn, who sat gracefully at a nearby table, engaged in conversation with the billionaire guest, who had earlier revealed her legacy. There was an ease about her, a quiet dignity that no amount of money could buy. Richard clenched his jaw, watching. His guests now gravitated toward Evelyn, eager to speak with her, to shake her hand. The very woman they had dismissed had become the center of the room, without even trying. And that was the harshest truth of all. Olivia had spent the night trapped between two worlds. Her love for Michael, and her loyalty to the family who had raised her. But now there was no hesitation. She turned to Michael, shame evident in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have said something sooner. I should have stopped them." Michael studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for her hand, his warmth grounding her. "It's not your burden to carry, Olivia, but what matters is what happens next." She nodded, her grip tightening. "Then I promise you this. Our marriage will not be built on the kind of ignorance I saw tonight. I won't let prejudice define our family. Evelyn, having overheard, gave Olivia a knowing smile. That's a good start, dear. Change isn't about words. It's about actions. Olivia met her gaze and nodded. I'll prove it. As the evening drew to a close. The Montgomerys lingered in the background, no longer the untouchable elite they had once imagined themselves to be. They had been humbled. Whether or not they would change was up to them. But one thing was certain. They would never forget this day. Because respect isn't about wealth or status. It's about how you treat others. And sometimes the person you look down on today might be the one who owns the room tomorrow.